As we continue our study of trials and testing in a believer's life, you'll recall that last week we looked at the test and the trial of Abraham in Genesis chapter 22. And this is where God asked him to sacrifice his only son Isaac as a human sacrifice in order to test Abraham's faith and obedience. Now, we all have a lot of trials in life, don't we? But I can't ever imagine a trial like that one. Can you? I can't imagine what I would do if God told me to sacrifice my one and only son whom I love as a human sacrifice to him. I can't even begin to think what I would go through in my life. And yet Abraham, we're told, passed the test. And God says, "Now I know, Abraham, that you fear me." In other words, Abraham, I know you truly will follow me whatever the cost. I mean, what a test. And Abraham literally passes with flying colors. And what it tells us is this: that a person can go through the most severe and imaginable trial of life if he or she really trusts God. Because it really comes down to our perspective of who God is and his role in our lives. And if you believe that God is on his throne, and you believe that God will keep his promises, and you believe that God will never make mistakes, and you believe that God always fulfills his word, and you believe that God will accomplish his purposes in your life, regardless of what happens, you see, that's the kind of faith that passes the test or the trial in life. And when Abraham was put through that test, that trial, he passed. Is it any wonder that this man is the single greatest human model of faith that we can emulate? Well, today in our time together, we're continuing with part 2 of our study by launching into the book of James itself, which is the Christian's handbook for living. It is the most practical book in the Bible for Christian living. And the book of James, in my opinion, is especially relevant for us as believers today. Now the question is, which James actually wrote the book? Because there's more than one James in the New Testament. Well, to cut to the chase, the answer is that it was written by James, the half-brother of Jesus. This is not the disciple James, Peter, James, and John, but this is the half-brother of Jesus who did not become a Christian, by the way, a believer in Christ, until after the resurrection, until after Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, the book of James is a very short book at the end of the New Testament. In fact, it's only 5 chapters long and has 108 verses. But this little book is jam-packed with practical advice for people who are living in and through difficult times in their lives. And it covers every possible emotion that you could be feeling. For example, it tells us what to remember. It tells us what to feel or how we ought to feel. It tells us what we need to be. And it tells us what we should do when we're living through hard times and under stress from trials and tests in our lives. Now, the crisis through which the audience or the people were living to whom James was writing this little book was persecution. Persecution for their faith in Jesus Christ as believers. They were being evicted from their homes, and they were being killed for their faith by the Roman Empire. In fact, it was a very scary time to be alive. People were dying, and you could lose your life, literally, for being a follower of Jesus. You see, at the time James wrote this letter, being a Christian was dangerous to your health, and it could literally cost you your life if you wanted to be a Jesus follower. And that's why in the first verse of this little book, it starts this way in chapter 1, verse 1. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. Greetings. Now, the question is, why were these people, these Jewish believers, scattered? Well, the answer is because they were running for their lives. You have to understand their lives had been turned upside down by their circumstances. You see, they didn't just lose their jobs, they had lost their homes, and they could die. It was a real crisis for those early Jewish Christians. So James writes this short little letter to encourage them in a crisis and explains the kind of faith that we need. Not only what they needed, but that what we need. And he begins with the attitudes that we need to make a part of our lives in and through tough times, through trial and testing. Now let me read it to you, beginning in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Listen to what James says. And as I read these verses, please keep in mind that he's talking to Jewish believers who are in crisis. And he says, beginning in verse 2, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Now, in that passage I just read you, the key word of what I read is the word know. He says, because you know or understand certain things, you're going to have a whole lot better handle on the problems, the trials, the crises, and the tests that you're going through in your lives. Now, my friends, I want you to listen to me very closely. I'm going to say this and I want you to hear it. Your success in handling the stress and the strain of trials and tests, or any other crisis in your life for that matter, is going to be determined by what you know or understand. You see, how you handle stress or problems or crises or trials or tests will be determined by what you realize to be true. In other words, by what you know and what you remember and understand to be fact in your life. And the clearer your perspective is, the more stable and the stronger you're going to be when the heat's on in your life. You see, your perspective on life and on God fuels your faith. It feeds your faith, and it's your faith that gives you confidence to take on the challenges that life brings your way. You see, we need a faith that isn't crushed by the trials and tests of life. A faith that isn't destroyed when life goes sideways. And so when James begins this book, this letter, he doesn't waste any time or mince any words about the kind of faith that we need to have, the kind of faith that we need to develop in our lives so that we can become like Abraham and pass the test of life with flying colors. And so James starts out by teaching us 4 truths to remember or to know about trials and tests that we face in our lives. And the first thing that James says to us is this, as well as to his original audience. Trials and tests are inevitable. Number 1, the first thing we need to remember or know is that trials and tests in our lives are inevitable. In verse 2, he says this, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Notice he doesn't say if troubles happen to come into your life. He says, but when they come. He says you will face trials. You can count on it. You can take it to the bank. You will have trials and tests, tribulations in your life. Now, by the way, James wasn't the first person to tell us this or say it. In fact, Jesus said it. Jesus said, and I remind you because I told you this last week, but he says, in this world you will have trial and tribulation. Even the Apostle Peter says later in the New Testament, don't be surprised when troubles happen in your life. You see, what I want us to understand today is that nobody is immune. No one is insulated. No one is isolated. Nobody is exempt from trials and tests in their life. And so James says trials and tests are inevitable for a believer, for a Christian. They're coming your way and my way sooner or later. They're going to get here. And the bottom line is this. Problems are not an elective course in the Christian life. In fact, they're a required course. They're a required part of our curriculum as believers. You see, you can't opt out of the things you learn through trials and testing in your life. And to graduate in our Christian life, we have to go through trial and testing. They're inevitable if you are a follower of Jesus Christ. If you are going to grow in your Christian experience as a believer, then God says you've got to go to the school of hard knocks, which is the school of trials and tests. It's inevitable. It's required. It's part of our core curriculum. Number 2, the second thing James says that we need to remember or that we need to know is that troubles are not only inevitable as we just described and discussed, but secondly, trials and tests are variable. Trials and tests are variable. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, he means that they're not all alike. And, of course, we know this from our own experience, don't we? I mean, troubles come in all sizes. They come in all kinds of shapes. They come in more than, 31 flavors, don't they? And notice that again in verse 2, James says trials of what? Of many kinds. Trials of many kinds. You see, the key word here is kinds. Trials and tests come in many different kinds. They're variable. They come in a multitude of varieties. Trials of many kinds. The Greek word there literally means multicolored or varicolored. In other words, they come in umpteen different shades or types. The governments of the United States and Canada tell us that there are 415 varieties of weeds in North America. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a lot of variety when it comes to weeds, right? But there's even more variety in the kinds of trials and tests that we face in life. Far more variety. They're multicolored. They're multifaceted. They vary in intensity. In other words, how painful the trial may be, or trials. They vary in their frequency, how often they come. And they can vary in their duration, how long a trial or a test will last. So we know that they're not only inevitable, that we're all going to experience them throughout the course of our life, but that they're also variable. They come in so many different colors, shapes, sizes, kinds. They're a huge variety. Well, number 3, the third thing James says we need to remember, or that we need to know, is that trials and tests are unpredictable. Trials and tests are unpredictable. And that simply means they usually catch us by surprise. You ever see that or experience that with trials and tests in your life? They don't warn you in advance. You know, they just kind of show up like that unexpected guest that you don't want in your home when you're least expecting it, right? We've all had that experience. And so James says again in verse 2, whenever you face trials. And the key word is whenever. Whenever. Have you noticed that trials and tests just seem to come at the most inopportune times? I mean, think about it. You don't plan for them, right? You're not planning for trials and tests or difficulties in your life. You're like, when they come into your life unexpectedly, if you're like me, the response is, you've got to be kidding me, right? Not now, for heaven's sake. I mean, you know how it is. You get a flat tire when you're running late, or the baby throws up on your outfit when you're headed to church. And what makes a problem an even bigger problem is they often catch us off guard. It's when we least expect it. It's when we're unprepared. It's like it's inconvenient. And you know as well as I do, you can't schedule your trials and tests and say, well, you know what, I think I'm going to make time for this problem next Tuesday. You see, we can't control when they come into our lives. We can't predict when they're going to happen. We can't anticipate that we're going to be afflicted with a trial or a test. They just come unexpectedly, whether we like it or not. And you can just know you're going to have troubles in life. Now, the word face here, when it says whenever you face trials, is the Greek word peripesete. And it literally means to fall into something unexpectedly. It's the exact same word used in the story of the Good Samaritan, where the victim is unexpectedly beaten up by robbers. And in the Good Samaritan story, it says he fell into a band of robbers. In other words, it happens by accident, without anticipating it. He just falls into this problem. So trials and tests are going to happen in your life unexpectedly. And then number 4, James says we need to remember, or we need to know this, and this is really the good news. He says trials and tests are purposeful. Trials and tests are purposeful. You see, this is really the good news. There's a purpose that God has behind your trials and your test in life. In fact, verse 3 says, because you know that the testing of your faith produces. You see, trials and tests come to produce something in your life and mine. So what's James saying about trials? He's saying they're variable. He's saying they're inevitable. He's saying they're unpredictable. In other words, you can't figure them all out. And then he says they're productive. Trials and tests can be productive in our lives. You see, he's saying that problems and troubles can accomplish something good in your life. The stress and the suffering can have value in our lives if we have the right perspective. It's all about our perspective on these trials and tests that God brings into our lives. And James is saying that God uses difficulties for good in our lives. Now, how in the world can God use trials and tests for good in our lives? Well, that's verse 3 and 4. And in verses 3 and 4, James gives us 3 purposes of trials and tests in our life. And this is where we're going to continue with our study next time as we examine these 3 purposes of trials and tests and the reasons why God allows us to go through these unwanted and unwelcome trials and tests of life. And so I invite you to join me again in 2 weeks as we continue our journey through the book of James.